Morning, everybody. I gotta call an audible here for a second. Casey, get out of here. Where's Casey? Go home. Leave now. Casey is sick. He's raging sick. Will you tell him he needs to go? We love you. Now get out of here. Go. He shouldn't have been here in the first place, but can you thank him for coming in and go, leave. Take Wes. Bye, Wes. Bye, Wes. Uh-oh. I thought it would be easy, but no. We love you like mad, so go rest. So that means when I'm done with the message, you can leave. So there's no song at the end. You just saw the song, walk off. I promise, we'll be fine. Promise. Promise, that's an interesting word. What do you think of when you say I promise? When you think of promises that have been broken, think of promises you've made, think how difficult promises are. I think 100% of us are really good at both making and breaking promises. We all are. All of us make and break promises, and I think sometimes we can't even keep track of the promises we make and we break because we're naturally good at it because we don't understand how precious a promise is. A promise is a priceless thing because a promise is a yes. Now, not all yeses are promises. There are some yeses that are just like permissive yeses or empowering yeses, like, go ahead, do, yeah, that's fine. But every promise is a yes. Every time we make a promise, we're saying yes, and it's the platinum yes. It's the solid gold diamond encrusted yes. It is the high cost, priceless yes. That's what a promise is. And we make and we break promises like they're worthless, but promises are priceless things. It is the priceless yes that we say when we make a promise. So why are we so bad at it? Let me ask you this. How are those resolutions coming? How are those promises you made just a week and a half, 2 weeks ago? Oh yeah, I promise I'm going to do this. I mean, how's that going for you? We make and we break promises all the time. And I want us to understand the cost and how precious and how priceless promises are. And to do that today, I want to share with you two stories. The first story I want to share with you comes from First Horton. Now, I realize some of you are sitting here going, I've read through the Bible and I don't remember a First Horton. And you're right. You probably don't remember First Horton, but you probably do remember Second Horton. Second Horton is a book called Horton Hears a Who. First Horton is the book written by Theodore Geisel in 1940. It was his sixth book under his pen name, Dr. Seuss, and it's called Horton Hatches the Egg. This is First Horton, that is Second Horton. It was written in 1940. It was published by Random House in the years since, almost 80 years since this book was written. It's sold almost 1 million copies. But the book, Horton Hatches an Egg, is a morality tale about the importance of keeping promises. And the hero of the story is a conscientious elephant named Horton. Now, Horton has a friend, and his friend's name is Maisie. And it just so happens in the world that Dr. Seuss lives in, if your name is Maisie, that means you're lazy. And Maisie was a lazy bird. And one day, as Horton is walking by Maisie's nest, she is sitting on her egg, and she decides, I'm tired of sitting on my egg. Hey, Horton, why don't you climb up in the tree and sit on my egg? Now, you can imagine the dilemma, but Horton is a conscientious fellow, so Horton promises to Maisie and to the egg to sit on her egg until it hatches. This is how Dr. Seuss penned it. Very well, said the elephant, since you insist. You want a vacation, go fly off and take it. I'll sit on the egg and I'll try not to break it. I'll stay and be faithful. I meant what I say. "Toodaloo," sang out Maisie, and fluttered away. Now, what we find in the rest of the story of Horton and the egg is what it costs for a person to keep their promises. Because Horton has to jerry-rig the tree and climb up and sit on the egg. He's an elephant, remember? An elephant on an egg in a tree, it's kind of not normal. But he works it out, and Horton finally figures out how to sit on the nest, on the egg in a tree, and there he sat. And he sat, and he sat, and he sat when the weather got terrible, through the thunderstorms and through the rain. He sat through the winter and the cold and the freezing snow. And he sat in the face of the mockery of his friends, as the rest of the animals made fun of him for sitting on a nest in a tree on an egg. Finally, some hunters discover Horton in the jungle, sitting on the egg in a tree. And as they draw down on him, this is the scene that takes place. Did he run? He did not. Horton stayed on that nest. He held his head high, and he threw out his chest. And he looked at the hunters as much to say, "Shoot if you must, but I won't run away." And then the commitment that Horton made to his word, to his promise, he says like this: "I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful, 100%. That cost Horton his freedom. He wound up being taken captive by the hunters, who took him on a perilous sea voyage and then incarcerated him in a traveling circus. But Horton never broke his promise. He kept his word. And he says over and over in the story, Dr. Seuss reminds his readers of the priceless nature of a promise. As Horton says, "I meant what I said, and I said what I meant, an elephant's faithful, 100%. So how do we do it? How do we keep our promises? Last week we began a conversation about the power of yes. And a promise is a powerful yes. A promise is a promissory yes. It says, yes, I will see this through. Yes, I will follow through. I will commit to this. Keeping promises is the priceless price, the cost of a pure yes. Not all yeses are promises, but all promises are yeses. And today I want us to look at what it takes to speak the promissory yes, to keep our promises, to say what I call the resilient yes. But before we talk about that, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your word spoken by your servant, anointed by your Spirit, to challenge us, to invite us to understand the cost and the commitment of our promises. Pray that we would recognize the value of that and be men and women of our word. Pray that for myself and for my family and for all of us here. For I ask that in Jesus' name, amen. I like sharing stories about growing up on my grandfather's dairy farm in northeastern Pennsylvania. I like sharing stories about it because the values that were sort of invested in me, I guess you could say kind of beaten into me as a child, are values that have guided me throughout my life. They still inform and shape the way that I live my life personally. And the values of that farm are those small town American values. Our farm was about a mile outside of a little town called Saylorsburg, and to call it a town is really to embellish what it was. It was really an intersection with a post office and a general store, and there was a gas station there for a while. There was a barber shop and a meat market, and that's all there was. But I remember going into town like a mile down the road to little Saylorsburg, and going into town with my grandfather, and I never saw him pay for anything. Never. I mean, we would walk into Schick's General Store, and sometimes they would have the things that he needed already boxed up. He would walk in, he would just take the box, and he would walk out. He'd say, "Thanks, Frank. See you later." He would go into the barber shop. He went to the barber every Saturday. Every Saturday, he would go from about 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock after the cows were milked. He would go to get a haircut, and he had this hairline. It was a social experience, but I never saw him pay for a haircut. Even when I got my haircut, when I needed it, he never paid for it. We would go to the meat market. It was the same story. He would say, "I need this and this," and he would take it, and he would leave. You can imagine how that affects like a 6-year-old child, because I would walk into Sears and just take stuff. That's what Grandpa did. "I like this bike. I guess I'll just take it." Now, what we all know was that in that small town, those small town values, people knew each other. And in the cycle of income and expenses in a farming community, there were times when my grandfather had to run up a tab. And everybody in the town understood that Ralph would make good on his debts because they had his word. And I was taught not just by the example of my grandfather, but taught by the instruction of my father and my uncles and my grandfather, that a man is only as good as his word. That if your word is no good, then your integrity is questioned. When you make a promise, keep it. Be a person of character. And people of integrity are people who keep their word. And in that small Pennsylvania farming town, your word was everything. It was priceless. So how do we do it? How do we become men and women who keep our promises? Men and women who are men and women of our word. I mean, it was a day before credit cards and before you could pay for your things with your phone, but it might have been a better day because a handshake and a promise was as binding as any contract and more valuable. So how do we get there? Well, like Horton. We make a promise and we keep it. We stick to our promises. We say what we mean, and we mean what we say. But I want to share with you a second story. It's a story of a man named Joseph. It's recorded for us in the book of Genesis. Joseph was the 12th son of a man named Jacob. He had 11 older brothers. If you have an older brother, or you are an older brother, you should shudder in terror at that thought of having 11 older brothers. I mean, I took it as my responsibility as an older brother to basically beat the life out of my younger brother. It was my job to make sure that he grew up knowing who the alpha dog in the family was. Can you imagine having 11 older brothers? But this wasn't the root of the problem. The root of the problem was that Joseph's father, a man named Jacob, who was the son of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham, that Jacob told all of the people in his community and all of his older brothers, "Well, Joey, he's my favorite. The rest of you, you're nothing. Joey, he's the good one." That's a good way to ingratiate yourself to your older siblings. And not only did his father tell people that Joseph was his favorite, he made him a coat. You've heard of it, the coat of many colors, the Joseph in the Technicolor dream coat. And Joseph had the audacity to walk around in the coat. He also had the nerve, or the lack of common sense, to when he had this dream about his brothers bowing down to him like stars that would fall out of the sky, and they would bow down. And that would have been better off keeping that to himself, don't you think? But no, in his Technicolor dream coat, he tells his brothers, "Someday you're all going to bow down to me. I'm Dad's favorite. Did you get all of that?" And they got it, and they did what any reasonable older siblings would do. They decided to kill him. Literally. They had a plan. One day when they were out in the fields watching their flocks, they determined they were going to kill him and throw him into a cistern. And they were going to take the coat off of him. They were going to rub goat's blood on it. And they were going to take it to his father and say, "Oh, it's terrible, terrible. The wild animal chewed up your favorite son, Joe." But the better part of wisdom prevailed, and they decided, well, let's not kill him. let's just sell him into a life of slavery. And so when an Ishmaelite caravan with Midianite traders on board came by, they sold their baby brother for 20 pieces of silver to traders who sold him into slavery in Egypt. Joseph had promised, he had made a promise to God about the kind of man that he would be. No one else knew about it, but it came into play one chapter later in Genesis chapter 39. As a slave, he was sold into the household of a commander of the Egyptian Pharaoh's guard. A man of political and military and financial influence had purchased him as a slave. And Joseph had made a promise to God about the kind of man he wanted to be, and God blessed him so that everything that Joseph did succeeded. Every decision he made worked out. Every investment he made paid off. I like to think that every person that he met just couldn't help but like him. And Potiphar noticed this. He noticed the success that this Hebrew slave was having, and so he made him his personal assistant. And when he brought him into his household began to prosper. And soon after that, everything Joseph did in Potiphar's estate began to be blessed. And it says over and over again that God continued to bless Joseph. And Potiphar noticed it. And then Potiphar basically elevated him to the place where he was managing all of his affairs. And they ran so smoothly that his crops and his cattle multiplied, and his house was blessed because Joseph was over all of his affairs. But then it tells us in Genesis chapter 39 that Joseph, by the way, was a well-built, handsome man. Fellas, don't we know that burden? Don't we know? I mean, that's just a cross to bear, isn't it, guys? When people just evaluate us because we're beautiful, and we're saying, no, I'm more than just good looks. So most of us guys, we understand, don't we? That's a heavy weight to carry, but it's also a trap. Because Potiphar's wife said, "Oh, who is this handsome Hebrew man?" And she didn't beat around the bush at all. She basically walked up to him and said, "I want to have sex with you." Now the reality is there was nothing morally wrong with that. He was a slave. Her husband owned him. He was a piece of property. If she wanted to take advantage of him in that way, he had no right. There was no immorality in the culture that said he shouldn't do this. But Joseph had made a promise. He had made a promise to her husband. So when she comes to him and she says, "Hey, have sex with me," and he refuses, he explains that he can't do that because he made a promise to his master. And he made a promise because his master had entrusted to him all of his affairs, all of his property. There was no one who had equivalent authority in the estate of Potiphar like Joseph. And he had withheld only one thing, and that's you little hussy. Because you're his wife. And I made a promise to him, and I will keep that promise. And I can't do this wicked thing because I made a promise to God. I made a promise that I would not be a promise breaker, but I would be a promise keeper. Well, it tells us that as the days passed, Joseph tried to keep his distance from her, but eventually there was a day when the two of them were in the house on the estate alone. She had given up her quest, and she came to him and put her hands on him and said, "I want to have sex with you." And he knew the only way to refuse her was to physically flee. And as he did, she pulled the coat that he would wear, the coat that identified him as the authority on the estate. She took that unique coat from him, and he fled. As he fled, she screamed, and you can imagine the rejection that she felt. She screamed out, and she screamed out to the other slaves, the other servants on the property, "This Hebrew slave, he's come in here and he's tried to rape me. And I pulled his coat off. You see, he came in to try and do this to me." she waited till her husband Potiphar came home. Then she told him the same fabricated story of how Joseph had come in and wanted to fool around with her. But when he did, she screamed, and as he ran out, he dropped his coat, and here's his coat. It says that Potiphar was furious. And we don't know if Joseph had an opportunity to plead his case to say, this woman, your wife, she's a slut. You got to be careful of this woman. She's really not trustworthy. We don't know whether he was able to make his case or whether said, well, God knows. But he wound up in Pharaoh's dungeon. You know who wound up in Pharaoh's dungeon? People that Pharaoh never wanted to see again. It was a death sentence for keeping his promise. You don't think a promise is precious? You don't think a promise costs? Then you don't understand the nature of a promise. Promises are not cheap. Promises are the platinum yeses. They are the solid gold, diamond-encrusted yeses. They are the things that we say to other people that say, this is who I am. Now, modern psychology has broken down and done a lot of studies on how it is that we so easily break these precious commitments, how we devalue our promises, how we get that way. In 2009, there were 3 Swiss academicians at the University of Zurich. Their names are Thomas Baumgartner, Ernst Fehr, and Urs Fischbacher. Sounds like 3 Swedish or Swiss academicians. But Baumgartner is a neuroscientist, and Fehr and Fischbacher are economists, and they wanted to find out whether the brain acts differently when we are defaulting on a promise or a loan, and it's costing someone else a loss, and does our brain function differently when we keep our promises. And so they devised a complex series of tests where they put the subjects into a CT scanner and they asked them these questions so they could evaluate brain activity when you are making a promise and when you are breaking a promise. And this is what they found. The most important finding of the study showed that perfidious and I had to look up perfidious. I didn't know what perfidious. Perfidious means deceitful and untrustworthy. You can tell they're academicians because they use a deceitful word about deceitfulness. Could have just said, showed that when people lie, showed that perfidious patterns of brain activity even allow the prediction of future behavior. Indeed, experimental subjects who ultimately keep a promise and those who eventually break one act exactly the same at the time the promise is made. Both swear to keep their word. But brain activity at this stage, however, often exposes subsequent promise breakers. They found out that the more promises you break, the more comfortable you get breaking promises, and the more comfortable you will be in breaking future promises. And we create neural pathways in our brain that they can see. What this study concluded, or one of the speculations that they made, was that someday in the future, when you go to apply for a loan, they're going to give you a CT scan. They'll put something on your head, and they won't ask you to fill out any paperwork. They'll just ask you a series of questions, and they'll look at the brain scan and go, no, you're not going to keep your promise. We can tell from your brain. You think I'm kidding? You just wait. 50, 100 years from now, you'll walk into Chase Bank, and they'll put this thing on your head and say, are you going to pay it back? And you go, oh, I promise. And they go, you don't get the loan. Because our brains actually develop an increased capacity to break promises the more promises we break. Now, unfortunately, these guys didn't do a follow-up study to find out if we could repair that pathway by keeping our promises. But what that informs us of is our vulnerability. That when we think of promises as cheap, when we think of promises as breakable because we've developed a pattern, we've actually done what my mother used to call seared our consciences. There's actually a neurological thing that happens in our brain that says, I find it easier to break promises because I break promises all the time. I think what that reminds us of is how important it is to be aware of the promises we make. Here's a clue. Make less promises. I think one of the reasons that we break our promises is we just make promises. Sure, I'll show up. Sure, I'll call. Sure, I'll pray for you. Sure, I'll see you next Sunday. Sure, I'll take care of that. And even as we're saying it, we mean it. Yeah, I want to do that. But it's so cheap, it's so inexpensive for us to violate that. Maybe if we just made fewer promises and did what Horton the elephant does. I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. There's another series of studies that were conducted in the 1980s by two American psychologists. Their names are Wicklund and Goldwasser. And they wanted to find out if a person would increase the frequency of keeping their promises by telling other people about them. You know, you make a list and you show it to your friends. Here's my New Year's resolutions, or here's my promises, or here's my intentions for something. By making those things public, the general theory goes that I will be then accountable to you. If I say, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start eating healthier. And I tell you that, 5 days from now, I'm aware that you can come up to me and go, oh, how's that healthy eating going, Dave, while you're eating cheese fries over at All-Star Burger? Well, you know, I didn't really mean that. I meant like I'll eat healthy for 5 minutes. Because I think we all believe, and I think this is what Wicklund and Goldwasser believed, that if you make your intentions public, you are more likely to complete those promises, to keep those promises, to attain those goals. But shockingly, in a series of studies they did in the 1980s, they found that the opposite was true. And in 1982, they published a paper about what they called self-completion theory. And this was their conclusion. When we are committed to particular identity goals, like these are the kinds of people we want to be, like being a good parent, a talented artist, or a successful business person, we make promises to engage in a variety of activities in order to prove to ourselves and to others that we are, in fact, these kind of people. Good parents, talented artists, successful business people, spiritual people, whatever is valuable to us. We say, I want to be this. And what they found was that by saying it, that was as good as doing it. However, research shows that when our identity-based intentions are made known to or are noticed by other people, we are indeed less likely to translate them into action. They found that people who express publicly their promises, their intentions, their commitments, they express that to other people, are 30% less likely to keep those promises, to fulfill those intentions, than people who kept the promises to themselves. 30% less likely. Ironically, the more important the aspect of our identity is to us, by expressing our intentions to others, the less likely we are to go through with it. I want to be a good dad, so I say, hey, kids, I'm going to spend more time with you. I promise. I promise to take you to the zoo. I promise to take you out for ice cream. I want to be, I imagine myself to be a good husband. So I say, I want to spend more time with my wife. I want to spend more time building our relationship. I imagine that I want to be a healthy person. So I promise, I make commitments to exercise and to eat right. But what they found is just by saying it, I actually decreased the likelihood of doing it. Now, they also found in their study that the only way to increase the possibility of fulfilling our intentions or keeping our promises was to define publicly the reason why we wanted to keep those promises. That if I say I want to exercise more, I want to be healthier, it's why? Well, so as I age, I can stay more active. so I can stay more attractive to my partner. I can be healthier. I can have more energy. And as you begin to articulate and to express the motives of your intentions and the reasons for your promises, I'm going to watch less television. Why? So I can spend more time with my kids. Why? Because I want to be a good parent, and I realize I have a limited amount of time to spend with my children. So I'm going to watch less television because I believe it will help me to be a better dad. Now you're on to something. And they showed the people who could identify the reason for their commitments, their intentions, and their promises were more likely than average to keep their promises. It's interesting in the story of Joseph, as Joseph is encountered by Potiphar's wife, he gives her the reason why he can't violate his promise. In Genesis 39:7, it says, Potiphar's wife began to look at him lustfully. Come and sleep with me, she demanded. But Joseph refused. And then he tells her why. Look, he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. You want to know why I am refusing you? Because I made a promise to your master, and he has given me authority, and he has given me influence, and I don't want to violate that trust. How could I do such a wicked thing? And I had made a promise personally that we have no record of Joseph ever verbalizing to God, a promise to be a man of his word. And he said, how could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. I think this is how we recognize how precious our promises are. We recognize that they're not cheap, so we don't throw them around. We make less promises. Keep your promises to yourself. Unless there is a benefit in explaining to someone, here's why I'm doing this. Explaining to your friends, here's why I want to be a better friend. Explaining to your partner, here's why I want to be a better partner. Explaining to your children, here's why I want to be a better parent. Explaining to your employees, here's why I want to be a better boss. But otherwise, count those promises as precious. Count those promises as priceless. And be a good steward because they cost an enormous amount. It's what my grandfather taught me. It's what my father taught me. It's what the community taught me that I grew up in around my grandfather's farm. That a man is only as good as his word. And that when you make your promise, you keep your promise. And if you say it, you mean it. I doubt that my grandfather ever, in fact, I never remember him quoting the Bible to me. He kind of lived it out, you know. I know he was familiar with the teachings of Jesus. And I know he probably knew Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is telling the religious people around him, the spiritual seekers in his community. He's saying, all of you make all of these promises, and to affirm those promises, you swear by the temple, and you swear by Jerusalem, and you swear by your family, and you swear by God, and that's supposed to make these oaths, these promises that you make significant because you dramatize them. And in Matthew chapter 5, this is what he said, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, don't break your oath, but fulfill the vows you have made. All of those things that you're doing, just keep your promises, he says. Basically, he says, let me tell you this. All you need is to let your yes be yes and your no be no. For anything beyond that, it's just evil. It's just wrong. Broken promises are misspent, priceless yeses. We can never forget the cost of it. It caused Joseph to wind up in prison, in Pharaoh's dungeon. And it caused Horton to be towed into captivity in a trailer and carried through a perilous sea journey. And he winds up as a sideshow in a circus. He's in a traveling circus as a prisoner, just like Joseph. This is how Dr. Seuss tells the story. Sold to a circus. Then week after week, they showed him to people at 10 cents a peek. They took him to Boston, to Kalamazoo, Chicago, Weehawken, and Washington too, to Wichita, Kansas, and Drake, North Dakota. And everywhere thousands of folks flocked to see and laugh at the elephant up in a tree. Poor Horton grew sadder the farther they went, but he said as he sat in the hot, noisy tent, I meant what I said and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. Both Joseph and Horton and men and women of their word keep their word because they understand the cost of it. That it is the platinum yes. That when we spend it, when we exchange it, when we offer it, it is of priceless value. When people make promises to us and we make promises to others, these are of priceless value. Joseph's story turned out well. He was finally released from prison, and eventually he came to be an advisor to Pharaoh. And because of the turn of events, he was able to be in a position where he was able to save his family, his 11 older brothers, and his father from famine and starvation in Israel. He was able to provide deliverance for them. And so Horton's story ends well too. I hate to ruin the end for you, but this is how the story of Horton ends. You see, Maisie, lazy Maisie, was vacationing in Palm Beach. She was on the beach in Palm Beach when the circus came to town. And she thought, oh, I'll go to the circus. This has got to be interesting. And as she did, she discovers her egg and Horton on display in the circus. And she wants her egg back. So Horton, having fulfilled his commitment, having fulfilled his vow and his promise, is just about to leave the tree when the egg begins to hatch. And the egg hatches, and lo and behold, and only in the universe created by Dr. Seuss could this happen. What comes out of the egg is an elephant bird. And this is how the story ends. And the people came shouting, what's this all about? They looked and they stared with their eyes all popping out. Then they cheered and they cheered and they cheered more and more. They'd never seen anything like it before. My goodness, my gracious, they shouted, my word. It's something brand new. It's an elephant bird. And it should be like that because Horton was faithful. He sat and he sat. He meant what he said, and he said what he meant. And they sent him home happy 100%. Theodore Geisel is trying to teach his readers the same lesson of the story of Joseph, the same lesson that my grandfather was trying to teach me. That we should be men and women of our word, that we should keep our promises. That keeping our promises is a priceless gift. That we shouldn't cheapen it by giving our promises away recklessly or thoughtlessly, but we should be careful with our promises. So the question isn't, are we better promise makers or promise breakers? We're all good at both making and breaking promises. The question is, will we be good promise keepers? Will we understand the cost? And that being known as men and women of our word, being promise keepers, by understanding the value of the platinum yes, that we will understand that keeping our promises is worth it. I promise.